That's right, it's Saturday night. What's up, special beings? Tonight we're doing some high IQ literary analysis. That was Rooks G. We're going to do one more with Rooks G. Why not? It's Saturday night. Let's hear his new Altered Self. This is Altered Self by Rooks G. This is our homeboy. Make sure you go and like his channel over there, ROXG. Make sure you smash like right here. We're live. We'll be going in about 3 minutes and 41 seconds. Let's go. Why would I not play this tune? It's a tune. It's a tune. We're going to play this tune. Let's go. Let's go. This one is massive. Shouts out to Block Party right there. That's what we're having, a block party. Shouts out to Jethro. There's Crispy, Crystalline, Jason. That's another massive tune on a Saturday night. See, that's Altered Self. I like that one a lot. Yo, what's up, gang? What's up, special beings? Tonight we're doing some serious literary analysis. It's been a minute since we've done it. We've been doing a lot of movies. We did some literary analysis recently with Neuromancer, etc. But tonight, we're getting back into the classic literature here, especially the modern era. And this one really concerns the birth of modernity, and we're getting back to T.S. Eliot. I did a T.S. Eliot stream when the channel first started. That was, almost 3 years ago now. And I've covered Ezra Pound a bunch throughout a bunch of streams. So this one is really focused on, it's not so much the Lost Generation, which is, of course, the artistic, the literary time period in which the Wasteland was birthed. But this one is really about the synergy between T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. And this one concerns us because there's really no literary work. Well, there's no work of verse. There's no work of modern poetry that concerns us more than the Wasteland. It's still important. It is still relevant. It always will be. And The Wasteland was published in 1922, and it's amazing the amount of work that was released at the time. This was a special time where there was a lot happening, and Ezra Pound is at the center of all of this stuff. So he was working on getting Ulysses by James Joyce published simultaneously with The Wasteland, and this one is going to concern a lot of the history of literature and the modern era, because I'm specifically talking about this excellent book by Matthew Hollis called The Wasteland, Biography of a Poem, that came out not too long ago. Shouts out to my cousin who put me onto this book. And the reason that I wanted to cover it is because, I've read The Wasteland, I don't know, hundreds of times. And, of course, Ezra Pound. I've got many, many Ezra Pound books in the other room, and I've covered a bunch of them here. Personae, we're going to talk about Lustra, Personae, the Spirit of Romance, Culture, the Cantos. I've covered all this stuff. And one thing about The Wasteland is that it's still difficult for me to sort of get my head around and to figure out. I think that's part of it. I mean, I know the poem very well, but what is it saying? What is it saying? What is it? How can we encapsulate it? And what is it saying about the modern era and then the postmodern era going into all the way to where we are now? And I think that this is important because when we talk about modernity, when we hear about the Industrial Revolution leading up through the modern era and then creating all the things that we see now, it's important to discuss the fractured world and the landscape of literature in which Eliot really captured with this poem. It's a series of fractured voices, and I just want to read you a description. This is from page 282 about what the book is. This is this note I wrote is a discussion on Tiresias. Tiresias is one of the voices within the poem, and Tiresias is the blind seer that is in Oedipus's. In Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, which I also covered a long time ago, and he's a blind seer, which is the great paradox because he can't see what's in front of him, but he can see long term, and he sort of gives fortunes, but. I wrote the key to the entire poem. The Wasteland is conceived not as a collage of different voices. This is from the book. Not as a collage of different voices spliced together, but a single voice speaking variously to create an emotional unit. That's Ezra Pound talking about The Wasteland. And it is harmony found in consecutive discordant parts. And I think that really is something really simple to think about with the poem. It's 5 sections. The Burial of the Dead, a Game of Chess, the Fire Sermon, what the Thunder Said is the 5th section. What's the other one? Death by Water. What the Thunder Said is the 5th section. And so I think that one way of describing the poem, which Ezra Pound came up with, it's very funny, is when they asked him what The Wasteland is about, he said 4 words, a damn good poem. That's it. Of course, when T.S. Eliot is asked about what the poem is about, he simply says, he begins reading, April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, and he just keeps reading until the interviewer will stop him. Of course, somebody else later asked him, another journalist later asked him, how did you come up with The Wasteland? Where do you get your ideas from? David Letterman says, I don't know. I came up with they were in the old Skull up there. Were you out shopping for apartments, Adam? Where do you get your ideas from, Mr. Eliot? And he said, drugs and drink, young gentleman. That's what he said. Now, I think that's part of a troll from T.S. Eliot, and one of my final conclusions for the poem is that it is partly a troll. I think that it's probably taken 100 years for us to be able to see that it is a bit of a joke. Now, it's not a joke on the reader, but it is it's an absurdist, it's a kind of Ionesco absurdist look at the modern era and modernity because of all of the various splintered parts of literature that are formed into a cohesive unit, into a cohesive emotional unit. And, you know, it's interesting because he has so many allusions within the poem. He's, you know, John Webster, the White Devil, Duchess of Malfi, Coriolanus is in here. The Tempest is in here a number of times. Robert Browning, The Last Duchess. There's so much within the poem, but I think that what the speaker in the poem is attempting is to sort of fit all of art and all of literature into one work, and it strives more for effect rather than content meaning. And that's something that's pretty crazy in light of what poetry was leading up to this. So I think it's important to discuss where literature was going up to the point when Eliot moved. I think he moved to England in 1914, and this is really unlike any other work, because it's not just, I mean, Eliot wrote the poem and Ezra Pound edited the poem, but it really functions as a there's a synthesis between the two between the work of the two people that leads to the printed page that we have now. And it wasn't until 1925 that Eliot added the dedication under his epigraph, which was Il Miglior Fabbro, the better craftsman. And that's because after the poem was published, the fortunes of Eliot continued to rise, and the fortunes of Pound continued to go down, leading all the way until, anybody knows about Ezra Pound, it leads all the way until he was captured and arrested for treason during World War II, kept in a cage for a long time, then put into an insane asylum, released, took a long vow of silence, and then finally was released at the behest of T.S. Eliot, at which point T.S. Eliot had won the Nobel. He ended up winning the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was, they made him a professor of poetry at Harvard, and Eliot before The Wasteland was an interesting character because he was leading a double life, not in secret, but he was a major financial figure at Lloyd's Bank in England, and part of what happened was that, and Hollis really sums this up at the end of the book, that Pound really accomplished his editing process in three ways, and it wasn't just what was on the paper. You can read the whole facsimile of what he did with The Wasteland. I mean, he really did sculpt this thing. He helped T.S. Eliot to really sculpt a visual poem as well, down from this kind of ungainly block of marble. And Pound wanted to add way more to it at the very last minute, which I didn't realize. The poem was also named, it wasn't named The Wasteland until much later, but it was He Do the Police in Different Voices. He wanted to add the epigraph from Joseph Conrad from Heart of Darkness, which we've covered here. That was one of my favorite streams that we did. And Pound actually got him to get that out and said it doesn't carry the weight for the poem. And that in itself is an interesting statement. He ended up adding the epigraph from the Sibyl. And this is the epigraph for The Wasteland is interesting because it's in Latin and Greek, and this is where the Sibyl, the legend of the Sibyl, is that the Sibyl had wished for eternal life, and this is in the epigraph. She'd wished for eternal life, and she had neglected to wish for eternal youth. At which point she is a shriveled up piece of like fits in a jar, basically. She's just this shriveled up piece of carcass. And when asked what she would wish for, she says, "I want to die." And so that's this. This is part of the darkness that leads into introducing The Wasteland. Of course, most people associate the poem as a kind of statement, a pastiche on World War I, and it certainly is that. But it's not really as focused on World War I as provenance for the poem as I imagined it to be, according to Hollis's work here, which is, again, really fantastic. But just to start off here, I think it's important to talk about where the poem came from and how it came to be, and some of the other figures that are locked into it. Of course, usually what I do is say none of this matters and just talk about the poem and discuss the words on the page, the best words in the best order, which one of the interesting things about this book, but because I'm talking about this book, The Wasteland Biography of a Poem, we're going to go into what this book concerns, not just the poem, The Wasteland. And one of the interesting things with this is that because Ezra Pound is involved, there's so much literary theory and there's so much critique of what a poem is and what art is that it plays a role in the formation of the poem The Wasteland and Eliot as a poet. And that is really interesting to me because no other single figure had as much influence on modern literature as Pound did. I mean, he's really the kingmaker. He's there with everyone. He's in London. He goes to Paris. He's there with the Lost Generation. He goes to Rapallo, Italy. He teaches Hemingway how to write. Hemingway teaches him how to box. Hemingway called Ezra Pound the only living poet. He's there with Gertrude Stein. He brings in Eliot. Eliot is friends with Virginia Woolf. Marianne Morse is here. John Dos Passos. Ford Madox Ford. James Joyce, of course. Yeats and Pound had an interesting working relationship. And of course, James McLaughlin from New Directions, who a lot of these guys have intelligence ties, of course. But the main focus here is the Eliot and Pound. And another thing is how much of T.S. Eliot's relationship with Vivian Heywood really played a role in establishing some of the voices in the poem. Because this is really, I think this is really important for us now to understand, because as with all great literature, it's not just ambiguity, but it's a continuous reread where you glean new information, new ideas, and a new insight into the meaning of a work. And I think that the meaning of the work is probably clear to anyone who reads it, even on the first read through. If you were in literature classes, if you were in AP literature classes or whatever, you read this in college. Maybe you haven't read it. Maybe I've read it for you. But if you know the poem at all, it right away alienates the reader because of the number of allusions in the poem and the number of different languages which come into play. And that's purposeful. I think the purpose of the various languages is not only a kind of drive toward what Eliot and Pound are depicting as a globalist world, which now we can understand fully, especially in light of the last few years, but also that it alienates the reader into a sense of loss and almost apathy. And that, of course, is that's the spirit of the age of modernity. And one of the other people that comes into play with this pretty profoundly is William Carlos Williams. Now, William Carlos Williams has always really affected me as a reader and as a writer. And the reason is because William Carlos Williams, who was a pediatrician by trade, he lived in Paterson, New Jersey, and tried to write the great American epic poem, which was called Paterson, which does fail. I think that the great epics, the great American epic is probably in verse would be Song of Myself by Walt Whitman, or as Harold Bloom says, the great American epic is probably Moby Dick. I mean, it's the great American novel, and it really functions as a kind of almost spiritual, like some sort of Gnostic, Pentecostal, pure American statement of what the American religion came to be, as Bloom says, and is a prose poem that speaks at times almost directly to the soul. This is what Heart of Darkness does. This is another, we could see a parallel between Heart of Darkness and T.S. Eliot with Conrad, because Conrad, also one of the great writers in English. English was his third language, and Heart of Darkness is a very difficult book, I think, to understand on a basic logical and conceptual level. I mean, it's almost purely metaphysical. It's like you're in a completely different universe. In a poor sense, it would be like, Alex Garland's Annihilation or something. It's like you look at this new world, this new alien world that you're going into, and nothing seems to make sense. And that's sort of one of the only parallels that we have with that. Of course, we see that politically speaking all the time now. We always seem to be in some sort of new world, new era, some new uncharted territory. But, then Yeats comes in and says that we're turning in the widening gyre. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. And that also seems to be true, that history repeats itself in a number of spinning top gyres, where we just keep going back to the same thing. Not like reincarnating ourselves, but in terms of what we want and what we see and what is accomplished. And that has of course, that's for a number of reasons, but in terms of literary theory and in terms of literature, William Carlos Williams is a great guy to look at with this. It makes it very simple. And the reason is because everybody may know William Carlos Williams' most famous poem, which seems to be either, when you first come to it when you're younger, either a nonsense poem, not like E.E. Cummings, but a little less tonal and a little more concrete, or it is a great symbolic statement of, rural life versus the new modern city. You don't know what to make of it, but what you end up making of it is exactly what he says on the page. It's called The Red Wheelbarrow. Everybody probably knows this one. So much depends upon the red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. That's the poem. Now, that might piss you off listening to it because it's like, what are you talking about? That's not a poem. And people said that at the time. People said that kind of like when you look at a Jackson Pollock painting or something, that it's just splotches of words on the page. But what William Carlos Williams said was that literature was not made of ideas. Poetry was not made of ideas, beautiful ideas. It was made of words. And I think that sounds ridiculous and obvious, but it's also incredibly profound, especially in light of what Victorian literature and then later Edwardian literature and Georgian literature specifically, which is what Pound and Eliot were rebelling against, came to be. And that means that in the modern world, at the birth of modernity, the birth of the modern age, the birth of the literary modern age, which is officially 1901, that's the death of Queen Victoria and the start of the 20th century, and we have something completely new, which is that the industrial revolutions were ramping up to the point where all of a sudden, especially in America where we see that we're no longer just expanding outwards like we were in the 19th century with territory. We're actually expanding upwards. So we see, for instance, New York, that the Woolworth building is constructed and the Empire State Building goes up, and the language of the common person and the language of the street formed its own kind of vernacular. It was its own vernacular and formed its own poetry. And this is what Williams really, really captured, so that the sound of, people walking in New York or yelling to each other or workmen up in the sky, it had its own kind of rhythm, and there was a particular kind of beauty to it. And he said that that poetry basically had gotten away from what it originally was, like with Homer or with even with elevated metaphysical poetry like John Donne or with Spencer or with kind of a more agrarian poetry that functions as a voice of the regular person, like with Chaucer. I mean, it had grown to be completely. As Hugh Kenner, there's a critic called Hugh Kenner. Hugh Kenner is the great Ezra Pound and William Carlos Williams critic. And Hugh Kenner said that poetry was more focused on syntactical order and forming a rhyme scheme than on the cohesive rhythm of a poem determined by its meaning or by its speaker's voice or even by the words themselves. So the whole point of a poem is that if it's the best words in the best order, that you're saying something that no one else has ever said and that no one could say better in that particular situation. You can't ever imagine anyone saying that. You can't ever imagine anyone saying that. And this is the reason why, this is one of the reasons why we started the channel, is that just take the number of politicians or celebrities or movie references where there's a literary quote and it's aberration. It's like it goes far away from the meaning or even the context of the particular origin of that particular verse. So, I mean, take Shakespeare, for example, which we talked about with Richard III. If someone quotes, and you hear this all the time, the first line, the opening line of Richard III is quoted all the time, and usually with transposed words or things added or subtracted, to kind of give a reference and allusion to Shakespeare. But it's now is the winter of our discontent. Well, now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by the son of York is not an easy line to figure out. It's not as straightforward as you think it is because Richard III is speaking it. So if it's the winter of our discontent, is he saying that we were discontented and now all of that is frozen and gone away and now we are content, right? Made glorious summer by this son of York. So now we're in the summertime. But that also implies that wintertime is going to come back again, right? That the discontent of previous times will return, just like I was saying with in a kind of Yeatsian sense a second ago. Or is he saying that this is the worst time of our discontent and that it's brought to light and now we're making it full so that what people thought had gone away is actually going to come back in a big way now? So there's an ambiguity in that sense but also because Richard III is a dissembler. He's a double-tongued, well, he's the warthog, but he's double-tongued, right? He's an equivocator. He's ruthless. That's the whole point. And so I think that it's important to look at poems because, especially with The Wasteland, because there's so much ambiguity within the poem, and in a sense, it's as Yeats said, the center cannot hold. There seems to be no center. There's no central focus in the poem. I do know that the thing what I learned from this book, this Hollis book, is that this is really interesting. The thing that really inspired T.S. Eliot to write The Wasteland was listening to the funeral rites from the Book of Common Prayer, because he heard Psalm 39, and he goes up to this castle with Ezra Pound in France, and they come to the same conclusion, but in two completely different ways at the same time. So the main thing, the sort of argument that they had, which this gives birth to The Wasteland, was that T.S. Eliot revealed to Ezra Pound that personally that he was afraid of life after death, is what he said to him. He was afraid of. He wasn't necessarily afraid of dying, but he was afraid of what comes after. And so then they had this discussion about it, and this leads Eliot to somewhere completely different than where Pound is led, because Eliot starts to take more of an interest in organized. He was raised a Unitarian, and he leaves St. Louis. He leaves the Greenleafs and his family. He basically never sees them again. They're totally they're disgusted by him, even though he gets this job at Lloyd's Bank and all this stuff. And he marries this woman. The woman ends up being totally insane, and so he ends up thinking about accountability and what is art and what does it mean. And these are the kind of things that are distilled within the poem that every person, thinks about if they think, and especially artists. I've said before, this is my personal, thesis about art, is that all art is concerned with two things. All art is concerned with our relationship with God and our relationship with each other. Every piece of great art is about why are we here and what are we supposed to do while we're here. Even the art that is not about that, and the art that's not is still about that, because when you tape a banana to a piece of, with duct tape to a wall, or you put Duchamp puts the urinal on the wall, that's also a statement about meaning. And so the urinal on the wall at the Armory show is saying that, again, this coincides with the birth of modernity, is saying that that there is no meaning. And so that also, by definition, is a statement on the fact that it's an absence of meaning. So Eliot sort of goes the opposite way, and he starts thinking about this. And this is why there are a number of, you would look at the poem now and say there are a number of like almost ecumenical, globalist elements within the poem that are all leading to some sort of cohesive spiritual union. But that's what he comes up with in the poem. Ezra Pound comes up with the opposite. He says that, that it doesn't, in a sense, it doesn't matter, because Ezra Pound's religion really becomes a sort of social fascism. I mean, he really was. He became a fascist. Ezra Pound was based in a number of ways. I mean, but they're two things totally diverge. And then Eliot says, well, the ills of the world, especially the economic ills, are caused by people lacking religion, and by people, moving away from Christianity. The death of the Anglo-Saxon ethic in Europe, and the fact that the mass migration of people is beginning, and people are moving away from their roots. And Ezra Pound says, well, no, the opposite. He says that the disillusion of people and the injustice in the world and the economic ills are caused by religion because of the warfare. So it's a typical argument, but they come to the same points, but it's two completely divergent opinions. And what's really wild, the thing that really struck me about this was that they go to this castle and they see it's an old Norman castle, and they see a wall, a kind of wavy wall with waves etched into the wall, and this becomes a potent symbol for both of them, but especially Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound looks at this and sees the meaning of the world and life and how we live, especially with poetry in this, because he sees a kind of rhythmical structure to life, which is, Jack Kerouac called that the holy contour of life. He sees it as a kind of up and down, left and right, rise and fall, peaks and troughs, heartbeat, EKG, a kind of absence and fullness. But this is really interesting to me because he uses it in a number of his poems. He uses this wall, and how relevant is that now, though? Right, without even knowing any of that, that's one of the central symbols of the political world that we live in. It's the one thing that is divergent in groups of people, right? And how they think about things is the wall. Whatever you think about that's the word that comes up the most often. And the other is that I thought when I read this, I thought of the Anglo-Saxon poem, The Wanderer, because he says, in the poem, and all that's left, a serpentine wall. In the poem, the speaker in The Wanderer, and Pound knew this, and that's one of the reasons why this is important to me, and because Pound also translated The Seafarer, which was a poem that was a contemporary of the Wanderer, an Anglo-Saxon poem, one of the first poems in English, and it's in Anglo-Saxon and Old English, and both poems are around the same time. They both kind of precede Beowulf. And they are both concerned with essentially a Nordic Viking speaker who is faced with two things, with mutability and with what they call in literature the ubi sunt motif. The mutability is the sense that things will change and everything will go away. That's pretty ecclesiastical, right? Everything will go away. The ubi sunt motif says that it's essentially a question within literature that says, where are those who have gone before? And this is something that both of these poets, and the Wanderer poet and the Seafarer poet, we don't know their names. All we know is their work, which is pretty brilliant. I think that's about as great a praise as you can have for a work of literature, is that you don't know the name of the poet, you just know the name of the work that's associated with them. That's amazing. Who wouldn't want that as a writer? This is literature encapsulated into one thing. This is that great literature lives, it's always present, it's always in the present tense because it's archetypal, because every person can relate to this and because it speaks for us. And this is something that you, especially as a young man, you read these works and you think that, the violence in them is cool or the adventure is cool. But then you realize when you get older, this is something that wisdom, and both poems actually discuss wisdom, and what wisdom means to a man. And both poems discuss the fact that it's not just living in the moment. It's not just the thrills or the sensory, the passions, that life is also full of absence, and that we have to realize that we will come to a place where everything seems gone. All the people that we knew are gone. The Seafarer is great. I know I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but this has to do with both of these poems. This provides a provenance for both of these, for the wasteland and both of these poets. The Seafarer is about a speaker who is at home, and he cannot wait to get back onto the sea. He can't wait to face hardship with his fellows in a world hung with icicles, breaking oaths on the crest of a wave. He can't wait to get out and test himself and confront death, because in that sense that he feels most alive. And then he feels, when he's accomplished something through raiding and through taking and through adventure, that he can bring it back to his family, and then he can have the good times with his family. That's like the cycle of the seasons. That's what man doesn't want. That, the things that bond us are not always the good times. It's not the good times. A lot of times when we're in the good times, we don't know. I personally think you are blessed and fortunate if you're in the good times and you know it, and if you can sort of try and prolong that and make it last longer. But that rarely comes to us. It's usually in hindsight that we see the good time. And, most of the time when we're bonded with other people, when we feel really intense friendship or familial bonds with people, it's through hardship. Think of a team. I mean, just at a very basic level, I think of like when I was at prep school, and like lacrosse. I mean, it sounds so kind of stupid, but this is important. It's like lacrosse practice starts in like early March, and you're out there, and you got and it's raining and cold, and then it's still snowing outside, and you got to go out every day, and you're with your friends, and you're getting hit with a titanium stick, and you're knocking people down and stuff, and it sucks having to go out every day after school and do this thing instead of going off and smoking cigs with the fellows, or cutting off, or whatever you're going to do, just go fuck around and all that stuff. And then you realize that you've got this, you suffered together, and you've got this bond, and you will always have that. I mean, that's a basic, like a rite of passage teenage thing that we all have. But The Wanderer is quite different. The Wanderer is about a guy who he's already had what the Seafarer had, but now he has no one, and he says, paraphrase. He says, where is the Lord that I served? Where's my master? Where's the guy who the great ring giver? Where's the giver of gifts? Where's the guy that I could serve? And this is really a great metaphor, I think, for life, because, and of course for Christianity, because it's in, we all know, I think we all know, especially as we get older, that we find meaning in service. We find that we receive gifts by giving, right? When you're young and it's Christmas time and you want your toys and stuff, that's great. But then you come to a point where you go through, you lose your innocence in terms of you realize that death exists, and that people are here and they're not here for a reason. And then you realize that you have to go out and do things yourself, and that it's actually the giving of gifts that makes you feel fulfilled. It's like, that's why parents give toys to children. That's why you give presents. That's why you call people. That's why all of those things. It's giving. That makes you feel fulfilled without expectation of reward. That's what life is. And he has no one. He says everyone is dead. Everyone's gone. He remembers the hardship and the struggle and the war, and he sees warriors lined up against a wall with their spears, and they're blood soaked, and he says, all that's left, a serpentine wall. That's it. And so I think that's pretty potent in terms of the wasteland, because of course that leads us into the modern era, and the great culmination of modernity and the Industrial Revolution is the most horrible thing. It's this war for territory, fighting at the behest of bankers and whomever, where there's a bunch of guys jumping over a wall, running straight into a machine gun, and all of the terrible things about modern warfare are invented just for the destruction of entire generations of people destroyed, gone. And so I think that when you consider that with the wasteland, that it's more about the effect of it, the effect of the fact that T.S. Eliot is having such a hard time with Vivian Haywood, who is, and ordinarily I would not care about this. I wouldn't care about their personal relationships. I wouldn't care about it. But the fact that it's in the poem, hurry up, please, it's time. Hurry up, please, it's time. You're always saying something. You're never speaking. All that is the fact that the marital relationship in the poem fails and falls apart because there's nothing for them to believe in together, and because she is completely, I guess, mentally ill with schizophrenia or whatever she had at the time. They called it a nervous disorder, but she's always sick, and she wants it's clear that she wants a sexual liberation. She's on opium and ether and all this stuff. There were allegations that T.S. Eliot was a cocaine addict. I don't know, but I know that Pound talks about when he was living in Paris with all these other guys, and there was a guy from Detroit, a poet living above him, who was an opium addict, and he thought it was so funny because they never saw this guy eat ever. He never ate, and he tried to get his poems promoted as this genius, and then eventually it just kind of dissipated, went away. Dunning, we never really hear about his poems. Dunning, but I think that's how relevant is that now, right? How relevant is that now that with the breaking of bonds and everybody falling apart and nobody believing in anything, not us, but, people not believing in anything, and war always on the horizon. And the poem really makes that clear. Taking us through the book here, Pound's, so we go through, we start off basically with Ezra Pound's rules here, and Ezra Pound's rules for a new kind of poetry, which really, you may think that this has nothing to do with you, but consider that the novel didn't really exist until Henry Fielding and Daniel Defoe with Robinson Crusoe. It was really Charles Dickens who invented the modern novel with the serialized novel, it's still serialized, not in a one bound copy. We didn't really have popular reading well into the 19th century. And then in the 20th century, the novel really begins to take off, and that's when the Nobel Prize for Literature really strikes up, is when we start getting the modern novelist. James Joyce is still considered the greatest novelist of the 20th century, and he was promoted by Pound. Hemingway was part of this group. John Dos Passos. These guys were all part of the same group. This is really a modern conception. Before that, it was verse. You're reading philosophy, and you're reading, reading religious texts. Dostoevsky, of course. Yeah, Elon Muskrat brings up, in the 19th century. And we have, we have Eastern European literature, but Cervantes was considered the first novelist. He was contemporary with Shakespeare with Don Quixote, but there just wasn't popular prose. Speaking of which, it might interest a lot of people in here, of course, that the philosophy bros in here, the high IQ philosophy bros, that Bertrand Russell was important in T.S. Eliot's life, and Bertrand Russell also is really one of the causes of T.S. Eliot's the sort of deterioration of his relationship. I think that it's confirmed now. It's not in their letters confirmed, but it's confirmed that Bertrand Russell, that Vivian cheated on T.S. Eliot with Bertrand Russell early on in their career, or in their marriage. And Bertrand Russell was one of T.S. Eliot's tutors at Oxford, and there became a wedge between the two of them. Yes, he was certified creep, and the two of them really sort of split apart. There are a number of figures that are related to this. John Maynard Keynes also, plays a role in sort of through his writing with the advent of the wasteland, because Keynes was the guy chosen by the British Treasury to represent them at the 1919 Versailles treaty, and even his response to the treaty was like so telling. He quotes Shelley, and this is one of the other things that gave rise to the wasteland, because one of the other motifs in the poem, you notice, is rivers. There's a constant the flowing of the river, and basically that Eliot says at one point, I watched them, London Bridge is falling down. I watched them. I had not thought death had undone so many. He sees rivers of people. Pound had seen this with kind of trains full of people, but he also remembered the wave motif. Pound, remember, wrote one of the great modern poems, which again is a William Carlos Williams type of poem. In a station of the metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd petals on a wet black bough. He sees people coming out of the subway, and they are covered in soot, covered in Blake's dark, satanic mills, and he sees them sort of shining as human beings. But again, we have these sort of rivers of people, and one of the things that Keynes talked about at the Versailles conference was that one of the things that they were doing to destroy Germany was they were locking up all the waterways. This is something that is kind of forgotten in terms of the destruction of Germany, because people think about the stab in the back and what that entails, especially with reparations. But really, it was also the fact that the sacred rivers to the Germans, the Rhine and the Danube, etc., were all being taken over by international corporations and zones, and that this was going to lead to something very, very dark in the end. And God, let me find the quote from Shelley. He said, let's see, about gorging. I'll have to come to it. I got so many notes in this book. I'll have to come to it. Let's see. I'm sorry, guys. I've got so many notes in here. You know what? I did put it in the description. Let me see if I got it in the description here, because I put it in here. He said, let's see. Yeah, he said, in each human heart, terror survives the ruin it is gorged. That's Shelley, quoted by John Maynard Keynes after the Versailles Treaty in 1919. I'll put it in the description for you. So Ezra Pound, developing his rules for poetry, one of the things that he says is that poetry will be, the great literature will differentiate itself from the literature of the past, especially the Victorian and mainly the Georgian poetry. Georgian poetry, which was really championed by people like G.K. Chesterton. Pound had nothing good to say about Chesterton. When I think about G.K. Chesterton, I think about the way he's described is kind of like Sam Hyde. He's like 6'5", 300 pounds. He's this massive dude who really commands attention. But Ezra Pound did not like G.K. Chesterton because he said that he basically had nothing. He had a lot to say, but there was no substance. And this was because the poetry of Chesterton and what he wanted from poetry was essentially Georgian poetry about butter and cheese. I actually discussed before, I think it was one of the last poems, or one of the last analyses that Eliot at one time had like advocated for a society for the appreciation of cheese, but maybe that was another troll, or maybe Chesterton was trolling. I don't know. But Pound says essentially that literature cannot be determined by the music of a metronome or the rhythm of a metronome, it has to be determined by the music of the words. It's a specific music according to the rhythm of the line, and that the poet should not be emotional. The emotion of the poet should be formed from an emotional unit according to the lyric, meaning the lyric poem. The lyric poem is concerned with the fact that up until very late in human history, poems were sung. They were sung to the rhythm of a lyre, the instrument. And so that the natural rhythmical element of the words themselves, especially in English is a rhythmical language. It doesn't have the rhyme, the natural rhyme scheme that a Romance language has, like Italian or any of the five Romance languages. But it has a kind of onomatopoetic rhythm to it, focused on the things themselves. When you not just onomatopoeia in terms of like splat or thud or like Stewie says in Family Guy. Her name is Beatrice. It seems like her name should be more like oof or thud, right? But essentially, in English, our words tend to mimic actions, and this I think is really important because so much of Victorian poetry, not the great Victorian poetry, but much of the Victorian poetry ended up being a kind of jingoistic statement on emotion. Pound and Eliot did not like Invictus, for example, which is one of the great, inspirational poems. But you can see why they didn't like it. And by the way, that's my namesake. That's one of my distant cousins, William Ernest Henley. He was also a great friend of William Butler Yeats, who said that he was a great ladies' man. Did you know that? Anyway, the poem tends to be jingoistic and more abstract, but that poetry should be focused on the concrete details. And so, like for instance, with Ezra Pound, he insisted on getting Eliot to write every day. This is how he made him a poet. Eliot wasn't writing anything really when he came to Europe, and Pound insisted that he write every day as if he were working out, as if he were working out the muscle. And he essentially said that, if something terrible happens in your life, it's sort of every poet, especially every like teenage poet, wants to write about the death of their, name the person close to them. But you can write about it on the day and write as much as you can, but it won't be for 6 months or 6 years until you get something accurate, because it's much more important to focus on the concrete details rather than the abstraction. So to talk about death doesn't do any good. One must focus on the concrete details that allude to death. Let's go into some other things that Pound says. Coleridge is the one who said essentially that the best words in the best order is poetry, or a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, or powerful feelings recollected in solitude. That's Coleridge. And Wordsworth with lyrical ballads. They did not like Wordsworth, by the way. But he also said Pound said to focus when writing on, and this is good for anybody who's a writer, to focus on a small audience, not a large audience. Everybody knows, if you try and appeal to the widest number of people, you won't appeal to anybody. You have to focus on a person like yourself at your best, something that you are interested in, or at least some people like you. You can't speak to someone, especially when you're doing analytical writing. You can't write for someone who doesn't know what you know. You're not going to write for a student of yours. You have to write for somebody who knows exactly what you know and a little bit more. Also to focus on concrete images and detail. Pound says, beauty is difficult. The art instant is permanently primitive, and that Eliot begins modern literature with like a patient etherized upon a table. That's the beginning of that's a beginning. He's talking about Prufrock here, J. Alfred Prufrock, and that is the beginning of modern literature. There had never been anything said like that before, especially with the verb etherized. So we have nouns functioning as verbs, and that this begins the modern era. And this is something called the objective-correlative. And let me see here. I'm gonna pull out something specific here. He says, yeah, beauty is difficult, wrote Pound in Canto 74. He had made the point once before in 1914 with Wyndham Lewis in Blast. Ezra Pound began the Imagist movement, and he had a literary magazine called Blast. Eventually, these people all tried to publish through Poetry magazine in Chicago, through Harriet Monroe, and eventually, what pissed Pound off was that Pound was translating poems from Latin, and that Harriet Monroe had this hater publish a rebuttal of Pound's poems, saying that he had no idea about the translation. And Pound's response, which was kind of feeble at the time, but Pound responded essentially by saying, "No, I'm trying to discuss more the meaning and the effect, rather than the actual literal translation of each word. That's the whole point of a translation." He says that had been statement 7 of their manifesto. Statement 8 read, "In a chaos of imperfection, discord, etc., it finds the name stimulus as a nature, namely art born from a war-torn world should find inspiration in subjects not previously thought beautiful. That poetry should be a meeting ground for beauty and non-beauty was a thought engaging Eliot in 1919. In his Tradition and the Individual Talent, written that year, he would identify in 17th century literature an intensely strong attraction towards beauty and an equally intense fascination by the ugliness which is contrasted with it and which destroys it." I think that's important. You know, we tend to think about, you know, how what they established for the modern era, for modernity, has gone so far in the other direction that now we only have ugliness as beauty, right? Now we only have every building looking like a gray Taco Bell box or whatever, right? It's the destruction of the beautiful modern city and architecture. Modern art museums, splotched paintings. There's nothing classical being created anymore. There's hardly any beauty. There's nothing elevated. But in writing, this doesn't mean that we only have to focus on crime and ugliness and deformity and destruction, which is kind of the way things have become. But rather that there is unity and variety, and that life, the spice of life, has a kind of variation to it. I mean, look in nature. The tiger, Blake's tiger is beautiful when the stars threw down their spears. Beauty can be terrifying and terrible, but the tiger is also a predator. The tiger is also an animal that is created to eat meat and kill. And that also has a beauty to it. It lives according to its will, but it's also rough and nasty and lethal. But it's still a beautiful animal. So you can't just describe the beauty of the tiger. I mean, Blake sort of accomplishes that, but that life is full of kind of variety. But we've taken it so far in terms of where we are now that it almost becomes a moot point. He says, soon after, in the spring of 1920, he would write, "The contemplation of the horrid or sordid or disgusting by an artist is the necessary and negative aspect of the impulse towards the pursuit of beauty." The contemplation of it. That doesn't mean the actualization of writing, but at least the contemplation of it. At the same time, he cautioned against a modern tendency for frivolity in literature, by which the sensation of enjoying something ugly is more amusing than the worn-out enjoyment of something beautiful. This was a calculated judgment for Eliot to make in this moment, for it was the very charge that critics were making against his poetry. He had forgotten his emotions, his values, his sense of beauty. The Times was shortly to write of his poems, but Eliot would persist and would refine his pursuit to its most clear and elegant position in an essay on Matthew Arnold in 1933, stating, "The essential advantage for a poet is not to have a beautiful world with which to deal. It is to be able to see beneath both beauty and ugliness, to see the boredom, the horror, and the glory." This is kind of what he talks about when he is discussing the poet John Webster, who was the contemporary of Shakespeare. I've covered him in the Renaissance Poetry playlist, if you want to check that out. Eliot saw with John Webster, he said that when you saw Webster's plays perform Duchess of Malfi, The White Devil, that you saw the skin beneath the skull beneath the skin. Here's Okay, there's John Maynard Keynes brought up. Let's see. Let's talk about imagism. Poetry. Okay, this is we're talking about imagism. They said that poetry should be, this is page 71 of the book, poetry should be burned to the bone by austere fires and washed white with rains of affliction. The poet should love nakedness and the thought of the skeleton under the flesh. Printed alongside this account were 7 of Pound's poems from the period, including a reprinting from poetry of what would become a singular example of imagist verse. This was the station in the Metro that I quoted earlier. And let's see, on page 72, he says, the poem in the Station of the Metro, which is really a 3-line poem. It's a 2-line poem with a title, but it's really just a complete 3-line poem. The poem begins in the shape of 39 lines that were destroyed by Pound for their lack of focus. 6 months later, the poem returned in a draft of half its original length. A further year would pass before it found the 2-line haiku-driven form that survives. There was nothing accidental about the process, and he was never in doubt about his goal. In a poem of this sort, one is trying to record the precise instant when a thing outward and objective transforms itself or darts into a thing inward and subjective. The work that followed showed Pound at his most delicate and lyrical, forging a unique meeting place of Western rhythm and Eastern sensibility. It says, a lyric for Dorothy from the same time invited her with great poise to be in him as the eternal moods, not the sweep of a grand romance, but prone to the real, and therefore lasting toughness of life as a transient things are, while a later epigraphic poem captured faultlessly his style of the period. This is his poem about love. And the days are not full enough, and the nights are not full enough, and life slips by like a field mouse, not shaking the grass. It was a method, the movement of the outward and objective towards the inward and subjective that would be adopted by Pound and Eliot alike, though Eliot would find a different language for it when he came to express the idea in his essays of 1919, Tradition in the Individual Talent, and Hamlet. Pound also found a kind of kinship with the troubadours and the Languedoc poets. The past is prologue, of course. Here we have on page 106 and 107 the quote often attributed to Picasso, but this is from Eliot and Pound, that immature poets imitate and mature poets steal. That's because that's what art, that sort of speaks to the definition of poetry and of art in general, which is that never try and take what someone else said and make it your own. Eliot was also adamant about the fact that poetry can never be interpreted in other poems, which is interesting because you would think that he does that in The Wasteland, but he doesn't. That's why he quotes directly. And it must be purely transmitted. This is the same reason why in his interviews, when he talks about his work, he doesn't try to discuss his work or describe his work or what it means. He just simply quotes the work. It is, as my friend Maddie says, it is what it is, and it ain't what it ain't. Right? Yes, Clontarf there, quoting Dylan Thomas and Thornton Mellon, circa 1986. That's right. Hey, guys, thank you for being here, by the way. Make sure you like the share. You like the stream. Share the stream for me. Shouts out to DPH right there. I saw him a minute ago, Church of the Eternal Logos, our buddy. DPH did a great stream the other night on Confucius. I saw that. I saw a bunch of people in there. And it's interesting because we were just talking about Ezra Pound. And guess what? Ezra Pound translated Confucius, of course. This guy who was there for everything. Also, you can support me at the links that the homeboys are dropping in the chat there. You can also support me in a number of different ways. And you can hit that. You can smash that like. You can leave a comment afterwards. And you can hit the super chat, ask me a question, leave me a comment, whatever you want. Let's see. Go to page 73 with the objective correlative before I move on. And I get into kind of the crux of the poem here. Let's see. Yes. The objective correlative. Do you think it's necessary to subdue your personality to that of the person you are with in order to understand them? It was a question for which he had already had the answer no. Subduction was not a requirement. Subduction, not seduction. subduction. It was instead a case of being interested enough to forget oneself, which was a different quality altogether, he said. A need, in other words, to depersonalize. He forgets himself with his people, man. He forgets himself, man. I should have been a pair of ragged claws, scuttling across floors of silent seas, man. I'm a little man. He's a big man, huh? What are they gonna pick me? Me? Wrong. You. We are the hollow men. We are the stuffed men, headpiece filled with straw. Alas, when we whisper together, our dried voices, color without shape, meaning without motion. There's a reason why Kurtz continuously quotes T.S. Eliot, why Dennis Hopper quotes T.S. Eliot continuously in The Heart of Darkness as a neo-wasteland. Yes. There's a reason why one of the books on Kurtz's bedside table right there in his compound is, it smelled like slow death in there. Malaria, right? I think he knew more about me than I knew what I was going to do. Shit. Charlie didn't have R&R. All he had was some cold rice and a little rat meat. I did that course when I was 19 years old. He was damn near 38 years old. Why the fuck would he do that? Seems they didn't dig what he had to tell him, man. Yeah, but on his bedside table, he's got Jesse Weston's From Ritual to Romance, which I'm sure some of you guys have read. From Ritual to Romance, one of the great, by Jesse L. Weston, one of the great analyses of vegetative rights and Golden Bough-esque anthropological looks into Arthurian literature. But of course, that plays one of the major roles in the idea of the Fisher King and the wasteland, one of the motifs within the wasteland, which is that the Fisher King presides over the wasteland because he has been wounded in the thigh by impurity, as he has sinned, and so he must have the Grail brought to him by Percival, later Galahad, in order to restore the wasteland into the true kingdom, and that will be the kingdom that he knows is within himself and without. Right? He stands as a kind of, that the kingdom, the Fisher King's kingdom represents also, for him, he is part of the kingdom of God, and he needs to achieve this by, I think, and the Grail is the Eucharist, by worshiping Christ and partaking in the ritual. And so that is one of the motifs of the wasteland. This says the duty. This is really important here. This page is 114 and 115. T.S. Eliot says the duty of the poet is to know everything that has been accomplished in art since the beginning. And this is what I've always called the landscape of literature. This is, he says, in the cool air of the Font de Gaume cave, it was clear to Eliot what he had to do, to return to the sources, to know everything, to understand tradition in order to release contemporary talent. In the rock drawing of the Magdalenian draftsman, he now saw the key to understanding the change in what he saw he was about to call the mind of Europe. Eliot must have spoken with animation to Pound of his experience in the caves on their reunion, for he sketched a map of the route from the station to the cave in case Pound should ever wish to find his way and experience it himself. This was a place where Pound went up to this, on this kind of pilgrimage up to this mountaintop castle, and when he got there, he lugged a chain and a big old piece of wood, because there's a well up there, and he strung it across the well so that the lady who was the keeper of this castle could get water for herself from the well that's there instead of having to trek all the way down. Pound is pretty crazy because he really does give and give. And I actually, personally speaking, I prefer the poems of Pound overall over Eliot. Pound wrote a great deal. He wrote a lot, and he wrote far more than Eliot ever did. He was extremely prolific. But the great poems of Pound, to me, are more, they're more visceral than they are than Eliot's. And Eliot also, his poems are so ingrained in the consciousness of academia and of popular culture that, to me, they're brilliant, but they don't immediately impact me like Pound does. And here's the wave pattern that he sees. This is also in Sestina Altaforte. He says, Pound said in Canto 2, "So I in a narrow cave, secret scratched on a wall, and the last reader with handshake of departing sun." And he said to Eliot, "One can't read everything," he grumbled in an article in 1934. "The art of poetry, after all, was discernment, not comprehension, and it was not, despite Eliot's moment at the Font de Gomme, desirable or possible to digest it all. With one day's reading, a man may have the key in his hands," he wrote in the Pisan Cantos. Contra Eliot, the poet cannot know it all, but should instead train the mind to hunt selectively as the panther hunts selectively, taking no more than it needs to survive and prosper. And that's sort of the purpose. That's sort of the purpose of The Wasteland itself, is that there is discernment in terms of the application of the allusions within the poem, but it's the fact that the poet cannot possibly know everything. But I agree with Eliot in one sense. I agree. Why do you think Harold Bloom hated Pound so much? I don't think Harold Bloom did not hate Pound so much. But I can see why. I can see why their personalities would conflict, and that's because they were both incredibly outspoken as regarding what poetry is and what literature is. And one obvious reason why they would have disagreements in terms of thinking about them intellectually is that Pound was a fascist, and that Bloom is a Gnostic. He's a Gnostic Kabbalist, and that there's, but it's interesting because it's kind of like dialectical materialism. Their insights and what they think actually meets back around on the other side in the middle in quite a potent way. I mean, they both were against mediocrity everywhere, mediocrity. Remember Amadeus? Mediocrity. No, I am mediocrity. I speak for mediocrity. Remember Salieri? Yes, no, thank you. Yeah, with the anxiety of influence, and I sat next to Bloom once. I've told you guys this. I sat next to him in an Adrian Rich poetry reading at the 92nd Street Y in New York City. I knew it was Bloom right when he was walking up. It was so obvious. I'd read so much Harold Bloom, and he came and sat right next to me, and he sat next to me like Baron Harkonnen. I mean, this globular, massive, like, shaman guy sat next to me, and he grumbled and bumbled. He burgled and gurgled and grumbled the entire time. But it was funny because his gurgling was like a biological disapproval of Adrian Rich, and it matched exactly what was in my mind. It was one of the worst poetry readings I've ever read, and I knew that he was there. I knew that he was there to be a hater, which was pretty funny. That was pretty cool. Anyway, moving on to, let's see. I've already mentioned John Webster and how poems are transmitted. Yeah, okay, here's the quote from Keynes, and kind of already read that. Criticizing the wresting of German waterways away from national territory to international zones. That sort of speaks towards globalism in the future. Georgian poetry, I've already covered that part. That's page 163. There was a beef between William Carlos Williams, T.S. Eliot, and Ezra Pound. And William Carlos Williams is interesting, again, because he actually went to school at La Rosey, which is the CIA boarding school in Switzerland. It's where Richard Helms went and a bunch of these people. But William Carlos Williams and his brother went there. And then Williams tried to make his living as a poet in Paris. People forget that because he's such an American poet. But he went back to America, and he claimed that Eliot and Pound were pushing towards a more Eurocentric mental outlook in poetry, and that it was moving away from the sort of he wasn't a glowy, but he was one of the privileged. It was from an elite. You certainly have to be an elite to be there. But I mean, the question really is whether Eliot had any intelligence ties. I don't think Eliot had. This book doesn't make any case for him having any specific intelligence ties, especially during World War II. But all these people were ancillary to. All these people were in the same realm. I mean, Eliot was an Oxfordian, Harvard. He was the poet laureate. Not the poet laureate. He became a Nobel laureate, and all of those people are in the same circles. So they certainly knew people that were in intelligence. I mean, James Laughlin was one of these guys. Specifically, I think James Laughlin, the publisher of New Directions, and then also George Plimpton from Paris Review, they were both intelligence assets, and they were some of the guys that were. I think George Plimpton had a grant from Human Ecology Fund. I think that's right. He was one of the guys that was pushing the modern art movement in literature as an intelligence reaction to the communist movement that was happening in art at the same time. So that seems pretty clear. But this says, Pound and Eliot, by contrast, were old Yankees despairing at the generational decay of their culture. They simply couldn't have stayed. Quote, there is a blood poison in America, said Pound, moving the matter further onto troubled grounds. You don't need to fight the disease day and night. You never have had to. Eliot has it perhaps worse than I have, poor devil. The blood poison was not named, but the inference was clear. We know what that is. You know what that is, listening to this about Pound. It was, and then he says, one of the things was, it was immigration, he says, and Pound gave voice to resentment at the erosion of Anglo-Saxon Protestant settler values, to which Pound might as well have added, I'm going to skip that part because of the terms. Pound had written in the New Age that summer with the pose of tolerance, but whatever his motivation then, his language was so added with tropes about the Old South, generational stereotypes, and the use of hard R's that any effort to be progressive appeared undermined by many of his own assumptions, he says. I mean, Pound ended up in an audience with Mussolini, with Il Duce, and he was... You guys have you ever heard the recordings of Pound in World War II? Have you ever heard these recordings? There's one recording that I remember from when I was like 17, and it was in a documentary, and it said like Pound was detained for possible treason during World War II. And when you hear that, you think, oh, he was a poet and he was writing subversive things. And then they play the recording, and he goes, "The United States of America is fallen and full of usury. President Roosevelt should be, and so President Roosevelt is a traitor to the cause of usury." And then they put him in a cage for 6 months, and they really broke him at that point. But he had this audience with Mussolini, and Pound wrote extensively about the economy and about the interests of bankers and the things that have certainly now come to pass in terms of the global pyramid program. So he was right in many of those instances, but it would not do during the invasion of Italy. Yeah, he was not, but he was not lying. He was not lying, and he was not being disingenuous when he said those things. It's just that he said those right when they were about to be invaded, and so he got taken in. But Pound is, I got a couple of great, I've got a bunch of great Pound books here. Here's one of Pound's cantos books. This is an analysis of his cantos, and this is from my own AP teacher gave this to me with his own notes in it. He goes to the Rapallo conference every year. He's I think he's like a Pound trustee. This is my copy of T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. I've got like a dozen copies of The Wasteland in there. This is my Faber copy of The Wasteland that I got when I was in Belfast. This is one of the copies. This is the Library of America copy of Pound, which I'll go into in a little bit, talk about some of his poems. This is a great edition. This is a biography of Pound, which is also great. This is by David Heyman. This is a pretty decent edition. And then this is a pretty rare book. This is Ezra Pound in Italy. And this is published in 1970 in Italy, 1978 in the United States. Here's Ezra Pound in Italy. And this is just a pretty comprehensive, there you go, pretty comprehensive edition of Ezra Pound, and mainly dealing with Sistina Altaforte and talking about Italian architecture and his time in Pisa and Rapallo. There he is in Venice. There's the old guy. He outlasted all these people. He outlasted all of them. But he did not have it easy, and I think he took like a 10-year vow of silence. Here he is on page 215. The art of fitting words to tunes is not to be confused with the art of making words which will be musical without tunes, Ezra Pound said on Poetry. This is a perfect criticism of songwriters who think they rank as poets, I wrote in here. And here is on page 227 how the Book of Common Prayer and Psalm 39, where Eliot heard this at a funeral, was what gave rise to his idea for the wasteland, because he read, he heard said in the service, I held my tongue and spake nothing. I kept silence, yea, even from good works. But it was pain and grief to me. My heart was hot within me, and while it was thus musing, the fire kindled. For I am a stranger with thee, and a sojourner, as all my fathers were. In the morning it is green and groweth up, but in the evening it is cut down, dried up, and withered. He fleeth as if it were a shadow. In the midst of life we are in death, dust to dust. He is able to subdue all things to himself. O Father, to raise us from the death of sin unto the life of righteousness. Come, ye blessed children of my Father. Eliot's typewriter had seen better days. He's writing in Old English with the Old English with the S's and F's, and he says, and then this talks about his typewriter here, and then I wrote here, let's see, this is the analysis of the becoming of the wasteland, because he was drafting this forever, and this is a draft with a new vernacular. It fits Ezra Pound's 3 definitions of a poem. It contains Ezekiel, the Valley of Dried Bones, and your altars shall be desolate, and your images shall be broken, from Ezekiel 6:4. The John Maynard Keynes allusion to Carthage, with Carthage being razed and covered with salt, is in here. And then also, let's see, I put page 231, verbs, youth. What's this? Page 231. Let me look at this. Hold on. He says, let's see. This says, okay. So this is the beginning of what made the wasteland. This is when it transforms into what it became. So it says, a second page was spooled into the typewriter's paper rest. 4 spaced asterisks marked a subsection, and above those a folio number 2. And below there it came a line that was to become almost among the most well-known in literature, a frame so defining that generations of readers would commit it to heart. April is the cruelest month. But it was April is the cruelest month that was transformed into April is the cruelest month, breeding, where each of the first 3 lines and concludes with a verb giving it motion, that Pound really took notice of the poem and said that now you have something. It was a verb to make the difference, not a month of growing or nourishing or nurturing as any other spring might expect, but breeding as animals and bacteria breed, and in a moment of utmost cruelty. Its starting place in the line ending served as a supercharger and would fuel the early engine of the poem through a chain of reacting echoes. Breeding, mixing, stirring, covering, feeding, so ended 5 of the first 6 lines, propelling the poem forward. It was a sequence of nouns with guardian adjectives: cruelest month, dead land, dull roots, forgetful snow, little life, dried tubers. Only the spring rain countered the wither tone, like a memory of the once sweet downpour of Chaucer's When That April with its shores soot. The Boston lines had been plucky, if not wicked, but already from the second page, it was clear how artificial an opening of Tom's place would be. Chaucer's one of my cousins, by the way. Did you know that? Have I told you that before? He married into my family. Way back, but he's one of my cousins. For here in this second section lay the heartwork of the subject and the emotional hand wiring of the poem to come. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. A distinctive cadence, a personal modus of arrangement, remote origins of a personal quality is page 232 of the book. Each of Pound's 3 tests for a poem were met in these 7 lines. In form, it was quite unlike anything else. Neither Georgian, of course, nor Imagist either, nor resembling anything else of Eliot's, besides perhaps a partial likeness to the recent Gerontian. Even the number of lines themselves was unusual. 7, not quatrains or the more familiar compliance of 6 or 8 lines, but a tilt from the top that established a new timing from the outset. And then, mid-stanza, having anchored the septet, it tilted once more. Summer surprised us. The breath lengthened, the pace slowed, and it swept into an alliterative glide of swirling S's and whirling W's in a carousel of sound and childhood. Summer, shower, stopped, sunlight, winter, warm, when we were. The first of a busy cast of characters would take to the poem's stage. Enter a Lithuanian who feels not Russian nor German and a symbol of warring Prussia. Enter the reminiscences of Countess Marie Lariche von Murnich, the disgraced go-between in the doomed affair of the Archduke Rudolph, Crown Prince of Austria, and his lover. In these twin characters alone lay the fall of 2 great empires, and just as importantly, an accent for the poem, like a set of snapshots or sepia postcards spilled out upon a table. Here were the first of the sensory signals that the Boston scene hadn't managed to convey. The objective correlatives, as Eliot had come to call them, the symbols that he believed might serve to stir the emotive response of the reader, the faded, poor souvenirs of the passionate moments. What he's talking about here is the fact that originally he wanted to make the poem about a guy going through the city with his friends, going to the gin houses and drinking, and there's sawdust on the floor, and then he cheats on his wife, and it's all dark. I don't drink. No, it's all dark modernity and kind of common and rusty, and it's something totally different from what poetry had been, completely different. But now what he does is he transposes the Boston element of it into something that fits into any modern city, and it's still specific, but in it we read all of modernity, and that's why the poem is important. That's why it is now. That's why it continues to be important, because just like Eliot is saying that in the modern world, we had everywhere was different. Everywhere had their own unique look and their own unique aesthetic, and everything was different. And then we have this war that scars up the land and scars people and takes away a generation and all this stuff. And some people get rich, and other people come home in a body bag or missing a leg. All this stuff, and now the result of that is that everywhere looks the same. Everywhere there's nothing beautiful anymore. I'm not trying to blackpill you. I'm saying the way that it's become sort of when you think about, drive across America, right? Or go to, the way that corporate conglomerates take over everything, or the way that, this sort of postmodern facade has made everything, deteriorated any sense of beauty. He says that's what modernity is. That's what it will become. And so we have all of these various voices speaking from the past and the future, and yet they're all part of one voice, because there's no center to this whole thing. Yeah, did he live to experience a Walmart? That's a good question. I mean, he pretty much foresaw the Google city. That's right, Real John Connor. That's exactly right. Aesthetic terrorism. Yes. Hey, what's up there, Token Study? Good to see you. Hey, guys, everybody in there, make sure you smash that like. Thank you so much for being here. I really enjoy y'all being in here for this back to a pure literary stream. This is what I find the most fun. I love doing movies and stuff, but this is what I find the most fun. You can tell that obviously I love literature. I love that's the whole reason I'm doing this. But it's also, I don't need to make it relevant to you, but this is relevant to you. And you don't have to know poetry or read poetry to understand this, but I'm trying to explain this in case it seems like a disparate experience. The difference between if you read novels, or you read analytical works, or you read anything, most of what we read is obviously in prose, and it's determined by the paragraph. You know, we have words written in paragraphs because it's functional, it's utilitarian. But poetry is not that. Poetry is, the whole point of it is, like I said at the beginning, the best words in the best order. This is something that can never be said about the thing in any other circumstance, and you can't imagine anyone saying it. Shakespeare does not exist because people spoke like that. That's not the point. The only time in Shakespeare when people act on stage and have dialogue, or even a soliloquy or a monologue, when they speak how people spoke, is like, for instance, the porter scene in Macbeth. We can always see that because it turns into prose. So we have bawdy speaking, we have common speech. Later on in later Shakespeare works, we have prose sections out of verse, even from high up characters. But the point of the verse line with Shakespeare, with a complete metrical unit, with iambic pentameter, is because it's a model for order in the universe. It's order. That's the Renaissance order. We have unstressed and stressed syllables following each other in 5 poetic feet, making a 10-syllable line, because it goes down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. That's the way life is. That's how they saw the world. We in English now, even if you are English, the closest thing to Shakespearean English now in terms of its speech would be like probably maybe a Tangier Island, Virginia accent, or a Bristolian cadence. Those are like close to Shakespeare. But we don't really speak in iambs anymore. We speak in like anapasts. But that's not the point. The point is that our model of the world is not. These guys don't see free verse. It's not really free verse. It is form plus content equals meaning. When you look at a page of poetry, even now, and the reason why there's not really great poetry published now is because people don't know this. It's because the page has to have the way that it looks on the page, and what the words say and how they sound, and the order of the words is the perfect form for what produces content. Content is a synthesis between form. Content is meaning is a synthesis between form and content that produces meaning. It's all about meaning. Now, with The Wasteland, we sort of veer into effectual meaning. We have more of an overall tone, but there still is order within it. The Wasteland is not a free verse poem. There are sections of order, and where it is disordered, it is purposefully disordered. It's like that on purpose. It is not just somebody throwing paint on a wall because it's impressionistic, abstract glop. That's another statement about the CIA wanted to destroy people's belief in order in the world to counteract what they were doing in communist art. But the great art still does this. It's just people don't really understand, and that's fine. That's fine. It's not supposed to, I guess, appeal to every person. It should. Tiresias is one of the central elements within The Wasteland because, as it says on pages 282 and 283 here, it creates an emotional unity, harmony found in consecutive discordant parts. So Eliot revised the fire sermon and to include sort of a section on the Keynesian idea of the German rivers in 1919 and the future of a discordant globalism. Did you know Bertrand Russell named his son after Joseph Conrad? Did you know that? That's just a random factoid. Let's see. Also, so this is the analysis of the final section, what the thunder said. This is so great. This is great. My favorite section of The Wasteland is in What the Thunder Said, section 5. And I'm going to quote it for you here because it's so great. He says, let me find it here. I want to find the part that is not the facsimile. Where are you? Where are you? Here it is. Okay. Yeah, section 5. Jesus, this is so good. Okay. This is lines 359 through 360, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 366. Who is the third who walks beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together, but when I look ahead up the white road, there's always another one walking beside you, gliding wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman, but who is that on the other side of you? It's my favorite part. It's my favorite part of The Wasteland because he says in the notes, Eliot says he attaches notes to the poem, and what he says is this is partly a reference to the Antarctic. Is it the Antarctic? I think it's the Antarctic. What does he say? Let me find what he actually says. He says, the following lines were stimulated by the account of one of the Antarctic exhibitions. I forgot which, but I think one of Shackleton's. It was related to the party of explorers at the extremity of their strength. They had the constant delusion that there was one more member that could actually be counted. But this is clearly a mystical Christian reference here. When I read this, I see Christ in these lines. Right? There are two people walking on a road, and they're in the wilderness, and Christ is walking with them because they're walking up the white road. They're walking into salvation through privation. There is always another one walking beside you. Christ is always with you. Gliding wrapped in a brown mantle, Christ in a brown robe, hooded, and then it says hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman. That's because these people don't know Christ, and they see long hair and a person in a hood, and they don't know who it is. But they see, who is this person? Who is this person? Who is that on the other side of you? That's Christ. And I don't even know if Eliot knew that, and I don't think it's relevant. I don't think it's even relevant if he knew that. I think that the speaker in the poem probably knows that. But this is a perfect example to me of the fact that you ask the poet what they mean and they don't know. They don't know. This is transmitted from something beyond. This is something deep in his soul yearning for Christ. And at the end of the poem, the poem ends with, and he quotes in the notes here, that Shanti represents the closest thing to us understanding it would be the peace which passeth understanding here, which is Christian. But I think that what he's saying here, the reason why he says Shanti, he says da yada dam yadvada, which is give, sympathize, control. And so this is what the thunder said. This is this is the Buddha speaking. But that doesn't mean that this is advocating for some sort of, a one world religion, or even if that even comes into the poem. What it's saying here is that the speaker is alienated from Christ through himself. This is my opinion, and that the closest way he can relate to this is hearing it through Buddha, and that's how he's going to find Christ. That not Buddha is Christ. I'm not saying that, obviously, and that Sanskrit, his academic study of Sanskrit, and his way of looking at a metaphysical way of looking at the world and finding meaning in all this fragmentation, all this distance, is that he sees the past is prologue, and that he finds that the peace which passeth understanding is spoken through something else, but it is still, he's going to find his way into harmony, and the only harmony is with God, is with Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and not through a Sanskrit and Buddha. But that's the way that he doesn't know that. The speaker doesn't know that when he's saying this. I think, I know I'm getting kind of passionate about this, folks. I think that that's what I take in the poem. I've always wanted to say that. I wrote one of my AP final exam essays on this poem, and how way back in the day, and how I thought that the poem was positive. One of the questions was about, is this a totally nihilistic poem? And I think there is a lot of ambiguity, but I've always thought that the poem gave me something positive. There was something deeply positive in this, positive in terms of redemption and salvation. And I don't think that I'm reading something into it that's not there. I think that when you look at the poem through the viewpoint that the speaker is fragmented through different voices, it's this kind of a dissociation, and this is what the modern world brings out in a person, that we are so fragmented. We not just as people, like in a cohesive society. I'm talking about our individual person is warred upon all the time. Everything is against us in the world. And so I think that, Token says he'd be terrified. I think that there's fear and terror in this poem, but there is the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I think that eventually, hopefully, I read this where the speaker will find that and finds he says, the chair she sat in like a burnished throne. He's talking about Cleopatra. He's sitting on the shores watching Carthage burn. The world is burning. There's polyglot languages. There's a kind of, there's Babel is all around him. But look at his origins for the poem. He found the origin for the wasteland. Isn't it ironic that the wasteland, the poem, the idea for the poem comes from Psalm 39, and it comes from a funeral rite. It's a funereal speech and a funeral rite, but that is not the death to the world, right? The world, we live, we die, and death not ends it. And I think that this is a speaker that is completely separate from T.S. Eliot. This is a speaker in a poem, and this is why I think, and he is searching for salvation in the midst of an absolute hellscape, and I think that that is really powerful. It's a powerful poem, and one could read it a number of different ways. I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's such a famous poem. But I think that is Hollis kind of leads me to that. He doesn't specifically state that in the analysis. He states that what Pound said was that that it is a damn good poem, and one of the best. I'll read you this part in the analysis because this is really fantastic. He talks about, this is page 360 to 365. This is kind of a summation of the poem. Right before Eliot was about to get this. Okay, so hold on. So Eliot had not written the final two sections of the poem, and his wife is going crazy, and she's sick all the time and screaming and all this stuff. And so Eliot goes through something which I think creative people, I certainly relate to this, which is that he puts so much into his world and into creating something and into his thought and into, he's a hypersensitive person, that he feels this vacuum effect and he is incapable of even putting fingers on the typewriter. He's a depressive character. That's common with creative people. And he goes off to this sort of sanitarium in Switzerland, a health spa. And he ends up staying in the same room as Wyndham Lewis's old room. And guess who's there at the same time? Julian Huxley is there at the same time. He gets kind of tired of Huxley. And then he writes the final two sections of the poem, and he goes back. But then right before he knows he's got something great, and Pound is helping him edit it. And right before he's about to publish it, he says, hey, why don't I add like 3 more sections to the poem? And I'll add Gerontian as a preface, and I'll add one of your poems. And Pound writes back to him and says, in no uncertain terms, do not do that. Don't touch it. Don't do whatever you're thinking of doing. Just leave it and get it published. And then Eliot writes back to him and says, are you sure? And Pound says, you know what? He says, you know what, bitch? If you're not going to do that, he's not a Scotsman, but he's got this weird, Pound has a weird accent. Pound also would be great at tweeting because he writes he writes in a phonetic speech. And he says, fine, do whatever you're going to do then if you don't want to listen to me. So then Eliot says, okay, fine, I won't. And then he gets it published. Pound helps him shop the poem around. They finally find a publisher, but they have like a little bidding war. And one of the cables gets garbled because Eliot writes, I won't publish this for less than, he says, it's like 5. I don't know, there's an extra symbol in there according to the garbled cable, and Pound thinks he means 850 pounds, which is like a fortune. And then finally Eliot writes back, no, I meant 50 pounds. So they get it published. And then from there, he gets positions offered to him. He ends up being able to quit the bank. He works at Faber and Faber. He gets his Harvard position, all this stuff. And he eventually becomes the poet laureate, and he writes The Hollow Man. He later kind of stopped talking to Pound after a while, but then there was a point where Pound's fortunes started to really decline, and the press kept trying to get a comment out of Eliot. And Eliot says at one point to the press, "There is never a time that I will seek my own fortune at the expense of Ezra Pound. He's responsible for everyone. No one can take that away from him. He's the guy who got all these people published. He's the kingmaker here." And Eliot eventually gets him out. But he writes to Pound about The Hollow Man, and he says, "Do you think I should publish this poem, or is it all just a bunch of shit?" And Pound's basically like, "I don't know. It's pretty good." But at the end, he writes to Pound, and he says, "I think it's the best I've ever done," and Pound thinks so too. So Eliot said that summer. Pound, of course, would be typically blunt. He says, "Complimenti, you bitch." I am racked by the 7 jealousies. I thought that was funny. The two fellas just writing to each other. Yeah, he says, "Don't print the first 2, urged Pound." And then Pound is continuously helping him with paring down the words and, having an economy of language and efficiency in his poem, with everything according to rhythm and context and allusion, all the various invisible things that go into a poem. This is great. This says, page 362 is my favorite part here. He says, "Something truly exceptional had taken place between Eliot, Pound, and the Wasteland. Something truly rare. It wasn't that a good poem had been made a better poem through being well edited. That isn't what happened in Paris and London that winter. Instead, the common focus of Eliot and Pound transformed those pages into a poem for the first time. For what Eliot came back with from Switzerland wasn't yet a poem, or if it was to be called that, then it needed to be qualified, as Eliot later did when he said it was a sprawling, chaotic poem. Admittedly, it contained everything in that moment that the poem needed to exist, everything but its title and a beginning to the fire sermon, but its pieces were still provisional and had yet to be assembled in such a way as to make the most distinctive object from it. Like a sculpture, half emerging from its marble, the poem that Eliot brought back from Switzerland was neither defined nor discrete. It was still a miscellany of parts. Still a hinterland rather than the island it was forming. It had yet to become what Pound would say of it in 1924 when he called it an emotional unit. What Pound and Eliot achieved together in Paris and London didn't make it a better poem. It made The Wasteland a poem for the first time. Like Eliot's example of the catalyzing platinum, a transformation had taken place, a metamorphosis that was particular to the chemical minds of the two men. Dennis, yeah, that's what Ezra would have said about people. That certainly wasn't him. He was the guy who said that about people. They had found a way for the poem to exist within them both at the same moment, possessed by neither, but possessing of both. In that instant, the poem was neither Eliot's composition nor Pound's editorial, but a common project, equally imagined, inhabiting each man simultaneously and fully. The poem had become an event occurring in both men in unison, in creator and critic, in poet and reader, in two halves of a combining mind. Pound did not, of course, share the same life experience as Eliot, not with his father or with Vivian, not with Bertrand Russell, not with dispossession or the bank or any other of the influences on Eliot's life, but he understood how to experience the force of those feelings in the poem in which they were converging. And crucially, he understood how to transmute them into an experience that others might comprehend. Ezra Pound had, in Eliot's judgment of 1938, done so much to turn The Wasteland from a jumble of good and bad passages into a poem. But that's not to say that without Pound, the pages would not have become The Wasteland. And nor is it to suppose that the drafts that Eliot left behind are the only alternative to what the final poem might have been. Such are the materials that Eliot would certainly have achieved something spectacular on his own, but probably not here and not this spectacle. This is great writing, by the way. Much more likely, he would have reached a different poem, one that was longer, more various in its voices, more formal and pernickety, more unkind in its consideration for others, one that was more obviously attuned to the experiences of Eliot's own life, one that was less mysterious in its transposition. Pound's work on the poem that winter had been inspirational. He had dramatically stripped back the draft, clearing out all that he considered to be excess, explication, or autobiography, leaving behind a shorter, sturdier, and altogether stranger poem. His encouragement to strip out the fresco lines, to pare back the typist quatrains, and to shrewdly unstitch the piece from Eliot's surrounding work were instrumental decisions in the success of a final draft in which he had persuaded his friend not to clutter his typescript, but to entrust the work to stand confidently on its own. He may have misjudged the epigraph, and the decision to reduce death by water so dramatically was more open to debate. Powerful passages had been sacrificed, but the emotional unit of the poem had been strengthened. All right, there's one more part I'm going to read you. In the event, Pound had been an editor of the poem in three ways. He had helped it at the level of the line, guiding it through intricate decisions about phonemes, words, phrases, and whole passages, a mechanic at its engine room fine-tuning its performance. He had also aided it from above, defining its limits, melding the shape that it makes today, the poem of 5 parts that it is, and not the poem of 8 or 9 that it might have been. But beyond his micro and macro work on the text, he had achieved something more fundamental still. Pound had enabled Eliot in life. He had stood behind him from arrival in London in 1914 and encouraged in Eliot the belief that he was a poet capable of a work so significant as the poem had now produced. Pound had encouraged the conditions in Eliot for the most intangible but essential of editorial arts, confidence. That's fucking great. That's great writing. That's great. I really recommend this book if you're into this. It's a really fantastic book. I really think that that's important because it shows, that this wasn't a work written by committee. It was truly a work of something that was they had total synergy in their mode. They were totally in the zone. It's like in Eastern Promises. Remember, now I live in the zone all the time. And I think that, this is something that is, it's very, think how difficult it is to find somebody who is of a complete mind with you in terms of your outlook. And by the way, remember, these two guys had totally divergent outlooks in terms of the most important thing, which was their religious views. But they were at a total cross. They were at a crossroads in history, and they found themselves in the same place at the same time, and they worked together to produce this thing. Again, it was Eliot who wrote it, and it was Pound who edited it. But without the two of them, they wouldn't have made this thing. And that is truly something that I think is unique in life. I think it takes an artist's singular vision to create anything, but it also takes somebody. You got to have somebody to help you. And that's a lesson, not that we need to find a moral lesson in this, but that's something that I think that we can take away from this for anything that we do. It also shows that you have to be likable. You have to be somebody who is able to work with someone else, because you may find someone who will dedicate everything they have to you, and you will do the same for them, and you'll do it for a greater purpose. So I think that's really fantastic. A couple of things here about Pound. I mean, it's clear that I'm not going to go through them, but I've got a whole bunch of references here in this book where we can see that Eliot and Pound read each other a lot. And so Eliot took a lot from Pound in his reading. He stole, and Pound was fine with that. But some of Pound's work is so beautiful, is so brilliant, especially his personae and his lustra. Personae is one of the most profound works. It had a profound effect on me, just in terms of thinking about the world. I was walking across campus in my first year of university, and I had a drama professor who had been very kind to me, but he stopped me. He just came up to me, and he was walking the other way, and he stopped me, and he said, "What you got there?" And I said, "Ezra Pound's Persona." And he looked at me, and he said, "You know what persona means, right? It means mask. And we all wear a mask. We all have a mask. We all have a personality, and that is part of the mask we wear. So the question is, when will you be able to take off the mask as a person and reveal who you truly are? Who are you? Who really are you? See you later." And that's something that sounds like Dead Poet Society or something. But I mean, that one moment, that guy, that was like one of those things you get as a young man. Somebody really, really. That's if I had just had that one experience. If somebody can go to college and they have that one experience with somebody who's older and wiser than them and really puts something to them, then that's all you need. That's it's kind of like when I'm talking about books, and I'm not like this. I'm saying this is the way I see it. If you read a book and you take away one word or one phrase that sticks with you, like the poem "The Wanderer," serpentine, the serpentine wall, and now all that's left is serpentine wall. I remember that, and that means something so incredibly deep to me. I can't even put that into words, what that means. All that's left is serpentine wall. I can't put that into words, but that's some sort of soul secret to life. So Personae, that's what the book that I'm still trying to get published, my book of poems, is about. That it's about Personae. It's about megalomaniacal figures in the Third Reich, Imperial Rome, and the Troubles era Belfast. And so one day I'll be able to do that, and I will have a word about him in the credits or in the dedication. So anyway, but Pound's two great poems are, well, he's got three. That I would put in this category. One is Hugh Selwyn Mauberley. Hugh Selwyn Mauberley is really his sort of contemporary with The Wasteland. It's much shorter, but it is, and he published it under just the name EP, but he begins, this is really another statement on modernity. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he says, Hugh Selwyn Mauberley: "For 3 years, out of key with his time, he strove to resuscitate the dead art of poetry, to maintain the sublime in the old sense, wrong from the start. No, hardly, but seeing he had been born in a half-savage country, out of date, bent resolutely on wringing lilies from the acorn, capaneus, trout for factitious bait, caught in the unstopped ear, giving the rocks small ice way, the chopped seas held them. Therefore that year his true Penelope was Flaubert. He fished by obstinate isles, observed the elegance of Circe's hair. Rather than the mottos on sundials, unaffected by the march of events, he passed from men's memory. The case presents no adjunct to the muse's diadem. The age demanded an image of its accelerated grimace, something for the modern stage, not at any rate the Attic grace, no, not certainly the obscure reveries of the inward gaze, better mendacities than the classics in paraphrase. The age demanded chiefly a mold in plaster, made with no loss of time, a prose kinema, not assuredly alabaster or the sculpture of rhyme. There died a myriad, and of the best among them, for an old bitch gone in the teeth, for a botched civilization, charm smiling at the good mouth, quick eyes gone under earth's lid, for too gross of broken statues, for a few thousand battered books." That's fucking great, dude. That's Hugh Selwyn Mauberley. That's The Wasteland to me, but it's synthesized, right? Listen to this. Listen to this. This is World War I. This is Section 4. "These fought in any case, and some believing pro domo, in any case, some quick to arms, some for adventure, some from fear of weakness, some from fear of censure, some for love of slaughter, in imagination, learning later." This is war. This is now. "Some in fear, learning, love of slaughter, died, some pro patria mori, non dulce, non et decor, walked eye deep in hell, believing in old men's lies, then unbelieving came home to a lie, home to many deceits, home to old lies and new infamy, usury, age old and age thick, and liars in public places, daring as never before, wastage as never before, young blood and high blood, fair cheeks and fine bodies, fortitude as never before, frankness as never before, disillusions as never told in the old days, hysterias, trench confessions, laughter out of dead bellies." Fuck, dude. That's Ezra Pound. That's why I like him. It's just and then here's a statement on war, and this is the last one I'll read. This is one of my favorite poems of all time. I know I'm reading poetry here on Saturday night to you guys, so thank you for being here with me. This is Ezra Pound. This is The Return. This is a Languedoc, Norman, ancient European, Anglo-Saxon statement about war and life, and it continues to be relevant today. And this is where the wall comes in. This is called The Return. See, they return. See the tentative movements and the slow feet, the trouble in the pace and the uncertain wavering. See, they return, one and by one, with fear as half awakened, as if the snow should hesitate and murmur in the wind and half turn back. These were the winged withal, inviolable, gods of the winged shoe, with them the silver hounds, sniffing the trace of air. High, high, these were the swift to harry, these the keen-scented, these were the souls of blood, slow on the leash, pallid the leashmen. So that's Ezra Pound. So that's about it, you guys. That's it. That's The Wasteland, and that's T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. And I would really, I would really just recommend, if you want to look for something good to read, if you're looking for a way into verse, just read one of those. Read one of those. Just read one lyric poem. I wouldn't recommend reading, don't look up something inspirational, some sort of inspirational poem. If you're going to do that, then just read scripture, read the Psalms, because that's greater than anything that's ever been written. So read that. But this is clearly, in terms of a secular, this is literature, then when I think about my views of literature are completely different than most people, I think, when they think about literature, or especially when they think about poetry. When I think about poetry, I think about violence. I think about the strength of words and how they strike me in the blood. That's to me what it means to be alive. And that's what I was discussing at the beginning of the poem. And there's euphony and cacophony, and there's beauty, and there's a terrible beauty. But the way that Hugh Selwyn Mauberley talks about, does a kind of riff on the ancient, on Horace and on Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est, which is also a great poem. It's a fantastic poem. But it's two things, again, in divergent timelines, looking at the same event. And I think that's what literature is supposed to be. So it takes a lot of digging to get to something like that. It takes a lot of chiseling away at the marble of life to find something like that. But once you find it, I think that is extremely rewarding. That is inspirational. You didn't look up something inspirational. You found it yourself. Inspire, right, is in Genesis. God breathes is scripture, and God breathes into Adam and gives him life, and we all are inspired, and we breathe the breath of life. And so that's what I think that is. Okay, so let's go look and see if we got any support here. You guys, if you want to super chat or ask any questions or leave any comments, I would really appreciate it. Of course, I can answer anything you want or whatever. Let's see if we got any support here over on the. If anybody drops anything here, here's Jason. Of course, Jason drops $10. Thank you, Jason, so much. Jason says, this is from our good friend Jason here. He says, BLA question. As an outsider to the art of poetry, I've noticed poets who write about ugliness and degradation while others capture a transcendent beauty. Do you consider both of these polarities in poetry equally valid and useful, or are the Bukowski, Don Fonte, Ginsberg crowd simply getting their rocks off in a published debauchery confessional? Thanks, BLA. Hey, listen, Jason, great question. I'll say this. It's interesting you use the word confessional there at the end, because there's a group of poets called the confessional poets. This was Robert Lowell, Anne Sexton, Theodore Rothke, John Berryman, and Sylvia Plath. And I'll say that by answer, I'll just quote Robert Pinsky when it comes to this, because I asked him that similar question, and Robert Pinsky, who was the poet laureate, said the same thing to me. It doesn't matter about circles of poetry. It doesn't matter about poems who get their rocks off or who look for, who write about certain things. There's only two circles that matter. And this answer really pissed me off when he said it, but it took me a long time, and then I realized how thankful I was for this. He said, there are only two circles that matter, good and bad. And the bad circle is almost infinite, and the good circle is extremely small. But the good poems are ones that, like I said at the beginning, are concerned with who we are, how, our relationship to God and our relationship to each other. What are we doing here, and what are we supposed to do while we're here? What and the meaning of life. And I don't mean that they say that in the poem. I mean that they are archetypal, and that they can either uplift you or they can take you into hell, but they have a certain beauty to the language that is almost like, to quote Bob Dylan of all people, words written on every page like they were written in gold. I mean, that is actually that's a good way of looking at it. To sort of illustrate this, Pinsky, and I heard this one time, Pinsky recited this poem that he had written, and it's called ABC. I'll say this to you right now. It's called ABC, which I'm only saying because Ezra Pound wrote the ABC of reading. It's going down the page. It's an alphabet poem. There's only one punctuation mark, and it's a mathematical term. He said, ABC, anybody can die, evidently. Few go happily. Irradiating joy, knowledge, love. Many need oblivion, painkillers, quickest respite, sweet time, unafflicted, various worlds. X equals your zenith. So there you go. That's my answer. I think that, I don't read Bukowski. I think that Ginsberg wrote probably two great poems. And I've read a lot of Ginsberg. I've got, I've got all the beat writers here, but he's got probably two great poems, and I've seen The Best Minds of My Generation, Destroyed by Madness, Starving, Hysterical, Naked, Wandering the Streets at Dawn, Looking for an Angry Fix. I mean, that's about it. But it's the effect of it, I think. But I tend not to read poets who write poems that are like verbal portraits of everyday language. I don't think that E. Cummings is a beautiful poet. He's got one poem that I like, but I don't. Like Stanley Kunitz has like one good poem. People have like one or two good poems, but you have to make your way through that. You have to read to make your way through those things. I think if you were going to read something beautiful, my favorite poem of all time is Holy Sonnet 14 by John Donne. Batter My Heart, Three-Person God. That to me is a sublime poem. So that's where I would go with that. Thank you for the question, Jason. Let's look for some. The poems that I write are also mainly dealing with, in this one book, Runes are dealing with, are pretty rough and raw, but I consider the language beautiful, and it's part of a persona. So let's see. Let's look at, hey, thank you. Can't Get Fooled Again. Thank you so much. Bazed Tuition, $25. Thank you for that Venmo. Really appreciate that. $25. Thank you so much. That is a big help. That means a lot. And thank you to Ethan also, who dropped a big super chat earlier in the week. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate you, Ethan. That is so awesome. Yeah, George Herbert, Easter Wings. I'd read Easter Wings. George Herbert also gets stale because he is writing imagistic poems in a early sense. But George Herbert is a religious poet, so I think George Herbert's great. Obviously, Gerard Manley Hopkins with Sprung Rhythm. I mean, the Windover and God's Grandeur are two of the most beautiful poems written in English. But listen, man, people would not consider Ted Hughes' poems to be beautiful, but I think that they are. I think The Hawk in the Rain, Lupercal, and Crow. I think Crow is a beautiful book. It is absolutely violent. It's almost, it's almost, I mean, it's almost sickening at times, but it has a beauty to it, and the language affects me in such a way. I think Sylvia Plath poems are beautiful. I think Daddy and Lady Lazarus and Edge and Cut are for like very, very not, they're not uplifting. They are the opposite. But there is something powerful in those poems, so I love those. My favorite poets that I always go back to, the people that I love the most are Rimbaud, John Donne, Dylan Thomas, Ted Hughes, Yusef Komunyakaa. I like Sylvia Plath, and Yeats. I like Yeats. After long silence. It is right. All other lovers being estranged or dead. Unfriendly lamplight hid under its shade. The curtains drawn upon unfriendly night. That we descant and yet again descant upon the supreme theme of art and song. Bodily decrepitude is wisdom young. We loved each other and were ignorant. That's beautiful. That's After Long Silence by Yeats. But I think that the probably the most beautiful thing ever written is Psalm 84, is Quam Delecta, Psalm 84, Psalm 89. Revelation, the Book of John, the Book of Genesis. But those are religious. Those aren't in the category of art for me. Those transcend art. They are bigger. Those are specifically. Those are religious, but those are Christian religious books that transcend what art can be. I think that the closest thing to that, outside of that, would be John Donne and Holy Sonnet 14. So when just talking about secular art, I think that's different. But I think Macbeth. Macbeth is one of the most. Macbeth is probably my one of my favorite things ever written. It's just almost every word of Macbeth is fantastic. And it's a harsh book. It's really a terrorizing play. But I think that's beautiful. His language in the verse is amazing, right? He says, will wash this blood clean from my hands? No, it will. The multitudinous seas incarnate on, making the green one red. Shakespeare is amazing. So anyway, that will do it, I guess, with the support. Anybody else, if you have any support, if you want to leave a super chat, or you have any questions or comments, you can always do that. Hey, Michael H., welcome to High IQ Book Enjoyer. Yeah, you guys, if you guys want to grab a membership, I'll probably be doing a members only stream. I'm going to do it on Simon Armitage's not very good rendition of the Odyssey, but I'll be talking mainly about the Ray Fiennes movie, The Return, which just came out a little while ago. Maybe I'll get Mark Hacker to try and join me for that, because he put me onto that movie. So I'll be talking about that for the members. Also, we'll be doing something talking about the Oscars when that comes up. I'll be doing. I think I'm going to be doing David Lynch with friend Maddie. We'll be doing Blue Velvet, etc. And what else? We've got the stream with Jamie coming up in about 3 weeks or so on Aleister Crowley. Other than that, I've got a bunch more literature to read and get through. And that's about it, you guys. If you got anything else to say, you got anything else, put it in the comments afterwards. Really appreciate it. Please help me get these numbers up, you guys. Trying to get to 4,000 subs here, and I'm trying to get my numbers up for each of the streams. If you want to see me on anybody, reach out to them. Tweet them. I don't have Twitter, but tweet them. Ask them if they want to do a stream with me for me. Get me out there if you want to see me anywhere else. But I'm just happy also to be here with you guys here on a Saturday night. Thank you so much for being with me here and listening to me discuss poetry. I really love that, and it means a lot. So I love you. Love you guys. Listen, was it worth it? Yeah, it's worth it if you're strong enough, right? All right, you got to keep on LIVIN. Love y'all. Let's listen to Rushdie one more time with Altered Self. Love y'all. Have a good night. Have an even better week. and a great February. I really mean that. I hope we all, it's the year of love. I hope we all succeed. Hey Sage, how you doing there? Good to see you. Thank you so much. Hope we all, get what we're working hard for, and that we, all your family and friends, stay safe out there, and, bless everybody there. And I love you guys. So thank you so much. Appreciate y'all. Love you. Peace. Here we go. Brooks G. Hey, one more super chat here. This is Venmo from Misty Murray. She dropped me $5. Thank you so much, Misty. I wanted to get that in there. Thanks for the poetry night. Have a great weekend. Hey, thanks, Misty. Really appreciate you. Thank you so much.